how do you test the sonic performance of a digital to digital converter? After all, it's operating entirely in the digital domain, where we can't exactly listen to what it's doing on its own. And then there are so many variables that are very hard to control for. I've done my best though, so I can tell you about the Gustard U26 digital to digital converter. And you might be wondering what a digital to digital converter even is. It's a device that takes a digital input, such as USB coming from a computer or a streamer, and converts that digital input into a different digital output, such as optical, coaxial, or I2S. And then you might wonder, why would you even want one? And that's a fair question. The answer can be any combination of 3 reasons. The least likely reason these days is that maybe your DAC doesn't have a USB input and that your source only has a USB output. The other reasons are that maybe you might want to connect multiple DACs to a single digital source. If that single source device happens to be a computer, it can sometimes get messy when you start connecting multiple USB connected DACs to the same computer. And in the case of streamers, most streamers can't output more than a single USB output at a time. But then, the final reason that you might choose to buy a DDC, or digital to digital converter, is the one I'm going to focus on the most here, and that's its ability to potentially improve the sound of your system. And there are 2 ways that this can occur. Firstly, some devices sound better with certain specific types of input, like I2S for instance. More importantly though, and probably the strongest influence over the sound that you get from your system if you install a DDC, is that a DDC, or digital to digital converter, can actually help to isolate any noise from going from your source device into your decoder device. A DDC can also sometimes help to provide a better quality timing reference into your decoder device, and timing is super important in the quality of digital audio. But the challenge we face here, as I mentioned earlier with all the different variables, the challenge we face is that every digital device is a little bit different. When it comes to source devices, some digital sources output cleaner signals than others. Some source devices have better timing accuracy than others. And then at the other end, each decoder is different too. Some are more susceptible to noise and/or timing errors than others. And so, how can you tell if a DDC is worth buying for your system, assuming it's about more than just giving you the connection types that you want? The only way really to know is to test it, so let's try that. Let's test some stuff. But first, a little housekeeping. Firstly, Shenzhen Audio were kind enough to send me the Gustard U26 for review, and that means that I'll be sharing a link through to Shenzhen Audio in case you want to buy the U26 after you've heard what I have to say about it. But what it doesn't mean is that they have any influence over the content of this video. The only external influence over the content of this video comes from the sponsor of the video, and that's Dakoni Audio. Dakoni make all kinds of great accessories for your favourite headphones and earphones. Their headphone cable system is absolutely game-changing at both reducing the clutter created by having lots of different cables around, but also at reducing the cost of having multiple different cables for multiple different headphones. Their replacement range of headphone pads and earphone ear tips is also world-class and huge. And then they've got things like headphone carry cases and their MagDAC accessory to help protect your precious audio gear when you're out and about and you're on the move. These days, I can't really imagine living without their modular cable system or their headphone carry case. I use them regularly on a daily basis, and as I said, I can't imagine life without them anymore. And then, even better than that, is that you can have 10% off any of those products at DakoniAudio.com. All you need to do is go to DakoniAudio.com and use the code PassionForSound10 at the checkout. That's going to give you 10% off anything and everything from the Dakoni Audio site, and you can use it over and over again if you want to. I'll put all of the information that you need in the description box down below, including a link to DakoniAudio.com and the discount code PassionForSound10. But for now, let's get back to the review. I just realized that I need to tell you a little bit about the U26 before I tell you about how it performs, so everything can make sense here. As we've already covered off, the U26 is a DDC, or digital to digital converter. It retails for $1,000 US. And that may seem like a lot of money for a device that doesn't directly produce any sound or signal. It's for that reason that I would only recommend a device like this in certain circumstances. And I'll cover off what those circumstances are at the end of this video once you know a little bit more about how it performs. For now, let's cover off what it does and how. The U26 has a single USB input only. If you want a DDC that takes other digital inputs, this isn't it. According to the marketing, Gustard worked with Italian manufacturer Amanero to produce a custom USB interface for the U26. And the benefit of that custom USB interface is that it can handle extremely high sample rate audio, all the way up to DSD 2048 and PCM up to 1.536 MHz. That's way beyond what you're going to get from any SACD, CD, or streamed music. But it does potentially mean that you can use upsamplers such as PGGB or HQ Player to their absolute fullest capabilities. What's more important to me though when it comes to that custom USB board is that its design has emphasized isolating the USB input from the rest of the circuit inside the U26. And that kind of isolation is important at rejecting noise from getting through to the rest of your circuit, but it's also not perfect. A simple way to think about it is that if a signal can get through, certain frequencies of noise can get through too. And I'll share a little bit of subjective evidence of that with you soon. Other features of the U26 are a high-quality temperature-controlled clock and also a special circuit known as a CPLD circuit. Those are intended to combine to ensure that the outputs from the U26 have absolute timing accuracy. And let's just circle back for a moment to what I said about the temperature-controlled clock. The clocks used in DACs and similar digital devices are based around crystals that oscillate at a very certain frequency. Unfortunately though, those oscillations or the rates at which those crystals vibrate isn't at a fixed frequency as such. It can vary with the temperature of the crystal. And so by placing those crystals inside a special temperature-controlled and insulated box, the DDC can maintain a predictable and precise timing signal no matter the temperature of the outside world. In other words, if you're using the U26 in an Alaskan winter, it's going to perform exactly the same as if you're using it in a Central Australian summer. Some other features of the U26 are the use of an internal linear power supply with a discrete design. And basically what that means is that the engineers at Gustard have created and crafted a tuned linear power supply to deliver clean, stable sound to the rest of the circuit. And then there's also some software control built in that allows you to control things like the latency and the buffer size of the U26. But I didn't play with that for this review for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that we already have plenty to talk about. And the second reason is that I don't expect many people to dive that deep into tweaking their system. But it's there if you want to, and if you're someone that has the U26 or a similar Gustard device with similar settings, and you've played with those settings, let us know in the comments what changes did it make and what settings did you find were the best. For now though, we're done with talking about the internals of the U26, and it's time to briefly talk about the external connections so you understand everything I mean as we're moving forward. As I've already mentioned, there's only the single input, and that is the USB socket. Or at least I should say the only signal input or digital input, because there's also a universal clock input for a 10 MHz external clock. You might choose to use that if you have a clock system that can synchronize the clock in your DDC with the clock in your DAC and maybe the clock in your CD transport. Or maybe if you just thought that an external clock delivered better clock quality and accuracy than what's already built into the U26. And I have tested that. In other words, I've tested the U26 with an external clock, and I'll tell you about that shortly. But let's move on to the outputs now, and the U26 has many. It's also important to know that all of the outputs on the U26 work simultaneously. In other words, you could theoretically connect a DAC to every single output of the U26 and run them all simultaneously with sound coming from all of them using just a single USB source device. I can't think of why you'd want to do that, but it's possible. And so onto the connections, we've got a regular RCA digital output and an optical output, both what's called the SPDIF protocol. But then there's also under this cover a BNC coaxial output as well. That uses the exact same transmission protocol or SPDIF protocol as the RCA socket, but BNC can sometimes be better because it's impedance matched from the sockets to the plugs to the cables and back again. In contrast, the RCA sockets and plugs are almost never the correct impedance, and that can theoretically cause some degradation of the sound quality, but that's a topic for a whole different video. Moving on to the other choices given to you by the U26 though, and we've got an AES socket and two I2S sockets. One of the I2S outputs is labelled I2SG, and it has a fixed configuration of the pins used to transmit the signal out of the HDMI socket, and it's ideal if you're going to be connecting the U26 to another Gustard product, such as the X30, the R30, or the R26, for examples. The other I2S socket has the ability to change the pinout configuration through the front panel on the U26, and that's going to make it more versatile to connect to other DACs. All of the different configuration information is in the manual of the U26, so I'll let you read up on that to get to understand how it's going to work with your particular DAC. And that's largely because I'm itching to get to talking about the sound quality with the U26, and you're probably itching for me to get there too. I discovered during my recent review of the FiiO Warmer DAC that the EverSolo T8 streamer is a good enough digital source to elevate the performance of DACs to a level where sometimes the differences become harder to distinguish. Another way of saying that is that a poorer quality digital source reduced the performance of one of the DACs in that review. Just a little bit, but it was enough. On the other hand, the T8 made both DACs sound fantastic. And so having come off the FiiO Warmer review just recently, it left me wondering if the T8 was so good as a streamer that adding something like the Gustard U26 would really make no difference to it. And then to make this test even harder on the U26, I also used the Chord M scaler and Chord DAVE as an upsampler and DAC combo because they're also very, very good no matter what you plug into them. The idea here was to see if adding the U26 to an already highly optimized setup would do anything at all. I ran a tubuless Consensus USB cable from the EverSolo T8 into the back of the Gustard U26. I then ran the LAiV High Fidelity Storm reference BNC cable from the back of the U26 and into the Chord M scaler. That same cable was then able to be switched from being from the U26 over to making the T8 the direct source into the M scaler, so I could compare easily with and without the U26 in the circuit. That type of test did mean some extended delays as I switched cables and I switched the outputs on the T8, so it did make it a little bit difficult to properly understand what was going on, but I did still hear some clear differences with extended listening sessions. With the U26 in that source chain, there was clearly more sense of separation and space around the sounds. It did take a few switches back and forth to 100% confirm and get certain about what I was hearing, but there was no doubt that it was there. With the U26 in the source chain between the EverSolo T8 and the Chord M scaler and DAVE, the sound from the system became more focused in the central image, there was more sense of space around each individual sound, and therefore a greater overall sense of separation of all of the sounds in the soundstage. As I've already said, it was a clear and obvious upgrade, but I also wouldn't say it was a huge one. And this comes back to what I was starting to say before. I would absolutely not recommend that you rush out and spend $1,000 on a DDC like the U26. If you could spend that same $1,000 to improve your DAC, preamp, streamer, amplifier, whatever it might be, another component that is more directly a part of the signal path. And in saying that, that sounds a bit strange because the U26 is directly in the signal path. It's just at the digital part of the signal path, not the analog part of the signal path. But the point being is that I think you'll get more gains from upgrading a primary component than from buying a DDC, which I would consider to be a secondary component. However, if you're going to build around a DDC like the U26, knowing that it's going to work with lower end devices just as much as it's going to work with higher end devices as you upgrade them, or if you already have your entire system in place and you're just adding this as a final piece of the puzzle, that's where a DDC like the U26 does make sense. But having said that, so far, this was just one test. I also wanted to be able to tell you if the U26 was better than its competition. And I'll get to that in just a moment, but I took a side quest first. I have the SMSL G1 master clock here from a recent review of it alongside the SMSL D200 DAC, and so I thought it would be fun to see what it did to the sound of the U26. And this was a really interesting test. When I started switching between using the internal clock of the U26 or using the SMSL G1 as an external clock, there did seem to be a definite difference in the sound. What I was less certain of though was whether I thought it was better with the G1 than with the U26 internal clock. And it was at about this point that the U26 started flashing up an external clock error signal. I never actually got to the bottom of what was going on there because I decided to go on and do some other tests and come back to the external clock test a bit later. And it ended up giving me the perfect way to actually test the impact of the master clock, as you'll see in a second. The next test I tried was to see just how well the U26 can level out the playing field, and to do that I used the xDuoo DP10 streamer that I reviewed a little while ago. The DP10 is a nice enough unit, but it couldn't quite match the performance of a proper desktop style unit in the form of the HiFi DM100, which actually costs a bit less than the DP10. And I'll be reviewing that DM100 soon, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see that one. What I started to wonder in the context of the U26 here was whether or not the U26 could elevate the performance of the DP10 to make it a match for the EverSolo T8. And straight away I'd say that it didn't quite get it to the level of the T8, but it got it close. In other words, adding the U26 after the xDuoo DP10 made a significant improvement to the performance of the sound coming from the DP10. If you were to compare the DP10 with the T8 without the U26 in there, it's a bit of a joke. The DP10 is really not in the race. It'd be a little bit like asking a team of school kids to play a sport against a team of professional athletes. However, adding the U26 definitely closed that gap. The separation and imaging in the sound from the DP10 going via the U26 still couldn't quite match the sound of the T8, but it was much, much closer. I did also feel like the T8 retained a slight edge in things like detail or resolution, and it came across in areas like a little bit more texture in the vocals of Randy Newman on Louisiana 1927. It was just a little bit more clear and defined or resolved from the T8. But the key point that I can't stress enough was that the DP10 with the U26 was getting very, very close. And it goes to show just how much help a DDC can be in your digital source chain. On the other hand, it also shows that a DDC does not make your choice of digital source, i.e. digital streamer, irrelevant. A better source before a DDC will still sound better than a lower quality source before the same DDC. And at the same time, using a premium streamer like the T8 was still better than using a lower quality streamer with the U26 DDC. That goes back to what I said before, where you're better off spending your initial money on the primary components and then looking to add the DDC as a finishing touch. But this is where the SMSL G1 master clock came back in again. Adding the G1 master clock to the U26 whilst feeding it from the DP10 streamer seemed to pull the performance level with what I was getting from the T8 on its own. Of course, the total system cost of the DP10, the G1 master clock and the U26 I think is actually more than the T8 on its own, but this was more about the test rather than the practicality of the setup. It made me wonder if maybe the output from the DP10 is a bit noisy, and that noise was still getting into the U26 and messing up its clocking accuracy, and that then using an external clock that was isolated and away from the noise of the DP10 was somehow improving the sound. However, further testing made me think that my first impressions were actually wrong. I think it was a case of my brain trying to find differences because I was looking for differences and trying to understand what the systems were each doing, and therefore I kind of was hearing things. Another way to put that is I'm absolutely not certain that the G1 was adding any real value once I did further testing and listening. And I've talked about the fact before that there are ways to overcome things like expectation bias. And that is something that I do in every single review, is no matter what I hear on my first impressions, I go back and I challenge those assumptions. And I'd encourage you to do that too if you're testing out devices like a DDC or a master clock. Don't just buy into what you think first up when you're expecting to hear differences. Come back and really interrogate those first impressions. Because when I did that here, the differences kind of went away. And so whilst I am not certain that there was absolutely no difference when using the master clock, I am certain that any differences that were there were definitely not worth the cost of adding the master clock. If there were any differences, it was maybe a tiny improvement in the sense of the image focus and the sense of space around sounds, but again it was so tiny as to be irrelevant and maybe non-existent. It was so subtle that I would actually bet that there was no difference long before I would bet that there was a difference. And so what this tells us is that if adding the G1 master clock to the U26 makes no significant improvement, then the clock inside the U26 is already excellent, and that's great news. It also tells us that adding an external clock is probably not necessary with the U26, and that maybe the only time you might want to add one is if you've got an external clock, like the G1, that can feed multiple devices that you own, such as a CD transport, the U26, and maybe the DAC as well, something like a D200 from SMSL. But the use of a clock to synchronize all of your digital devices is a bigger topic than I want to try to discuss in this video, so let's move on. The final question that I wanted to be able to answer for you was whether or not the Gustard U26 is as good as or better than its competition. Another DDC that I have on hand that is also very good is the Micro DDC from LAiV. The Micro DDC is a bit different in terms of how it's set up compared to the U26, but essentially they're still doing the same job and therefore they provide an opportunity to compare one another. What differentiates these two is that the Micro DDC is designed to take multiple inputs and deliver a single output, versus the single input on the U26 and the multiple outputs. Realistically, the LAiV Micro DDC is designed to be used mostly with LAiV's own products, and it's intended to take whatever digital input you want and to then send an I2S output into your LAiV Harmony DAC or your LAiV Micro DAC. And all of that means that there are lots of circumstances where you wouldn't even consider the U26 or the Micro DDC, because they're quite different in terms of how they're going to fit into your system. But if you happen to have USB coming from your source, such as a computer or a streamer, and I2S available on your DAC, then you could choose either of these and they'd both work perfectly. And so for my test, I ran USB into the U26 and I2S coming out. The I2S went from the U26 into the Gustard X30 DAC, and then after some listening, I subbed out the U26 for the Micro DDC, with now the USB cable going into the uDDC, or the Micro DDC, and that I2S cable now coming out of the Micro DDC and still into the X30 DAC. The process of switching all those cables did result in some lengthy delays between listening sessions, and it does mean that my certainty on what I'm about to tell you is somewhat low, but it's high enough that I'm still fairly confident. And what I found was that I believe the U26 does sound a little bit better than the Micro DDC. What I felt like I was hearing when using the U26 was slightly improved image focus and clarity in the image, and a bit better separation as well. It's a fairly common story. As you improve the digital source chain, you generally get a sharper, cleaner image and better separation of sounds, as well as potentially a more refined sound as well. And so, as you know from a few moments ago when I was talking about the G1 Master Clock, I would absolutely tell you if I thought the differences weren't enough to be worthwhile thinking about. But on this occasion, I lean the other way. I do think the U26 was just a little bit ahead of the Micro DDC, but at the same time, not a long way ahead. If you happen to love the size, the style, the features of the Micro DDC, don't for a second be put off buying that one over the U26, because if you weren't comparing them, you'd be completely happy with either. I just think that in this situation, the U26 is benefiting from a better clock setup and also maybe better isolation of the USB input from the rest of the circuit. It might also be that the U26's linear power supply is working better than the wall-wart external power supply in the Micro DDC. But again, if you're doing an all-LAiV system and you want everything to look the part, I'd still buy the Micro DDC. I'd also still buy the Micro DDC if you've got a situation where you have multiple digital sources that you want to all run through the same DDC. And so I'm not going to try to tell you that you should buy one over the other. I would think about it more in terms of the size of the device you want, the price of the device you want, and the specific inputs and outputs that you want, knowing that if it ends up coming down to the fact that you could work with either, and it all comes down to the sound, that's the time that I would lean you towards the U26. But really what all of this tells us, knowing that the Micro DDC is excellent, is that the U26 is a fantastic DDC. I think it looks great in a simple, elegant way. It's got excellent features and excellent functions, and it performs really well. And so if you would like a U26 in your setup, then please consider using the Shenzhen Audio link in the description down below to support them in the same way that they've supported me to deliver this video for you. And of course, don't forget as well about the 10% discount at taconyaudio.com. All the information you need for that is also in the description down below. But then if you want to understand more about the LAiV Micro DDC to help you understand which one to buy, or if you want to know more about what's going on in the world of clocks and timing inside digital devices, then you'll definitely want to watch the video that I've pinned here at the end next. But until next time, peace, love, and music, and I'll see you again soon.